interpretation. Yes, so thank you so much for accepting our request to do a review session, because Rinpoche yesterday gave so much material. I think, yeah, it will be of great benefit. Thank you so much, Geshe.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, everyone who's here. Oh, I forgot to switch on one light. Can you see me clearly?
It's okay, Geshe.
So I'll not want you to have to switch on. Okay, great. Now let's start. Yesterday there wasn't that much time. Today we have more time to set the motivation before we do the prayer. We start with the prayer of refuge and bodhicitta, the same prayer as yesterday. And before that, let's just take a moment to, well, breathe in, breathe out, to become aware of our mind, of our own motivation for attending this review class, going over what we learned yesterday, and if possible, to generate a motivation such that you think, well, may this coming 2 hours, may they help me to generate a better understanding of myself, of that which causes me problems, which causes me to hurt others, hurt myself, hurt others. And in that way, may I be able to reduce these harmful actions, these harmful thoughts, and so forth, not just for my own benefit, but also for the benefit of all sentient beings. Okay, all right. That should be enough. So let's go over what Rinpoche said yesterday, just to give you a short review. Can you hear me clearly? Can you hear me okay? Yes?
Yes, Geshe.
All right.
Yes.
Great. Okay. Now, really what Rinpoche talked about, in a way, is dependent arising. So he mainly spoke of dependent arising, if you like. Well, Rinpoche started off with giving a short introduction, of course, to Buddhism, which he said, well, initially he started saying, well, it's not prohibited to go right into the text. Of course, you could start with the text we're studying here right now, recognizing the mother, or is it sometimes called recognizing my mother. We could start right away with that. However, it's helpful to just have an introduction to Buddhism. That's what it's called. It sounds a little weird using it, literally the Tibetan word literally translates into introduction into Buddhism. And so hearing this, some people may think, well, I know about Buddhism. I don't need an introduction. I wanted a more advanced teaching since I have already been introduced to what Buddhism is all about. And so what Rinpoche said was, well, first of all, of course, there may be some in the audience who are new to Buddhist philosophy, to the Buddha Dharma. And for them, of course, it's helpful to hear an introduction, to put it all, well, to have some kind of overall view. What is the purpose of Buddhism? What is it all about? And so forth. But he said also for those who actually practice, who are Buddhists, who practice the Dharma, who live their life according to the Dharma, or, well, more specifically, he said those who actually practice Buddhism, it's still very helpful to hear it once again in that just setting up the framework. So to get a sense, this is where all what we're going to study, like here, recognizing the mother, this text, how it fits into kind of the summary of everything. And Rinpoche said, well, an introduction anyway, there's so many different ways of introducing Buddhism that it's just kind of, it just creates a framework to understand where it all fits in and how you should go about then after you got that framework and the form of this introduction, how you can then take this text and structure it, make sense of it, understand what you're supposed to do with it, how it is beneficial, and so forth. So it's just a reminder. And of course, when His Holiness the Dalai Lama teaches, and Rinpoche said, he said His Holiness recommends an introduction, which if you attend His Holiness's teachings, you're well aware His Holiness often, when there's enough time, gives an introduction to Buddhism. And many who listen to those teachings are very advanced practitioners. And still, they hear this introduction over and over again. And so, therefore, Rinpoche started with saying, what is Buddhism all about? And of course, he did it in order to lead us to this text, which is extremely deep, as Rinpoche said, very deep, as it presents the ultimate view of reality. And so there are many different views of reality, but here, the view that Changkya Rölpai Dorjé, the author of this text, set forth is this highest view. It's the view we should practice, we should put into practice. It's so important. And in that context, Rinpoche also explained then in his introduction how it is important, why it is important. Okay. His introduction started with a verse that many of you are probably familiar with. It's from the Patimokkha Sutra. It's the single verse. Do not commit a single unwholesome action. Cultivate excellent virtue. Completely subdue your mind. This is the teaching of the Buddha. Using that as the main verse, if you like, based on that, he gave his introduction. And he explained it. He said, well, you can explain it from the point of view of the three higher trainings, which are morality, concentration, and wisdom. And you can explain it from the point of view of three types of person. If you were present a few months ago, Jadu Rinpoche also gave a teaching on this verse and gave exactly that explanation based on the three higher trainings and the three types of person. Anyway, Yangten Rinpoche also explained, he didn't explain this verse from the point of view of the three higher trainings, morality, concentration, and wisdom, but rather from the point of view of three types of person. And those three types of person, well, is often they're described as a person of a lower spiritual capacity, of middling spiritual capacity, of greater spiritual capacity. That's how it's often described in English, and then, of course, translated from the Tibetan. And I've come across some criticism or some unease about calling it that, saying there are people who have less spiritual capacity, those of middling spiritual capacity. Well, it's important to understand this. And this is, I think, where there's some confusion just in terms of the translation. Of course, the word, it is capacity, it is potential, greater potential, lesser potential, but it needs to be, of course, explained in a certain context. First of all, it's all about certain objectives. Buddhism, first of all, it is taught with the purpose to lead us to a certain goal. I mean, it's not just taught for the sake of philosophy, because it's fun to hear all these ideas and just continue our life the way we always did, but rather it's talking about happiness. First of all, everyone deserves to be happy. Everyone needs to be happy. I mean, it's just it's a human right. It's a right that any sentient being has, and it's the healthiest way for our mind to exist, to be peaceful, to be satisfied, to be happy. And therefore, that's the goal of Buddhist practice. To have happiness right here and now, actually, definitely very important from a Buddhist point of view, to get rid of some of our fears, of our doubts, self-doubts, anger, and so forth, like states of mind that are actually causing us problems, that are painful in and of themselves, or right away lead to problems and difficulties. So that's definitely the purpose of Buddhism. But we're very good at this already, to look after our own self right here and now. But we find it harder to look in the future. We have a harder time thinking of the future. Well, we do take out insurance policies, and we pay into a pension fund and so forth. So we do have a sense the future is important. We need to prepare for it now, eating healthily, doing sports and so forth, so that towards, well, when we get older, if you're young now, so when we grow older, we have less problems and so forth. So we're actually kind of used to this idea, but from a Buddhist point of view, there is even a further way to look. So, look further in the future, which means also a future lifetime or liberation or enlightenment. There are certain goals, certain objectives that we can all attain. Our mind has that capacity to attain these goals in the future life. Well, of course, if you have a problem with future existences and future lives and so forth, but at least to allow the possibility that life goes on, the mind continues on, just in a different situation, so that we can actually do something right now. There are certain techniques set forth to take care of ourselves in a future existence, or to overcome this limited existence altogether and attain what's called nirvana. So the mind continues to exist, but in a form that there's only satisfaction, there's well-being, there's peace. Or even greater, to attain the enlightenment of a Buddha, which is actualizing the full potential of our mind, all the abilities that our mind actually, the capacity that our mind actually has, but that we abstracted from, that our mind is prevented by certain wrong views and so forth to actualize. So there are these three goals that we can actually achieve, and we all have the capacity to achieve all three of them. So when we talk about a person of lesser capacity or middling capacity, that's just saying temporarily they're not able to reach, for instance, enlightenment. So just briefly, the person of lower spiritual capacity would be someone who only aims for a positive future lifetime. So a person of middling capacity is someone who aims for liberation. And the person of greater spiritual capacity is someone who aims for the enlightenment of a Buddha. Well, why is it temporarily the case that someone doesn't aim for Buddhahood, that someone doesn't aim for liberation? Well, because they don't have the wish. They don't have the wish to do so. It's as simple as that. So you really just have the capacity right here and right now to reach a higher goal if you want to do that. But we don't. Let's be honest. We're very attached to our existence right now, and there's the analogy that's sometimes given. We're in a prison, the door's wide open. We could actually walk right out of the situation we're in, but we just don't want to. We're attached to our pleasures, our ordinary samsaric existence, and we just don't take that step. So therefore, a person of lower spiritual capacity is just saying someone who wishes for something right now and not for more, and therefore they don't have the capacity right away to move towards enlightenment. So in that way, think of capacity as there's an aspect missing. Of course, they have the capacity. Anyone has the capacity to become a Buddha. But for right now, what prevents us is not having the wish to attain that high state. All right. So Rinpoche anyway talked about these three types of person, and he said, well, this verse that he quoted, do not commit a single unwholesome action, cultivate excellent virtue, completely subdue your mind. This is Buddhist practice summarized in those three lines. Do not accumulate a harmful action, body, speech, or mind, and do the opposite, accumulate positive actions, beneficial actions, and subdue your mind. So I explained these three aspects from the point of view of these three goals, the three types of person who have three different objectives. Now, if you aim only to be reborn in a better state or in an equally positive state as a human being, for instance, well, we should avoid harmful actions, and these harmful actions are usually described in the form of the 10 non-virtues. Those should be avoided. And not only should we avoid these harmful actions, of body and speech, of course, but also of the mind, which gives rise to actions of body and speech. Those should be avoided, and we should engage in the opposite, in beneficial actions. Of course, the opposite could mean to refrain from killing, to refrain from stealing, so refraining from the 10 non-virtues, but also take refuge as in like rely on the instructions given as to the Dharma, which teaches to be kind, to be compassionate, and so forth. So to take refuge, but also to, well, do what I just said, engage in virtuous types of actions. So that would be to cultivate excellent virtue. And subdue your mind, well, work with your own mind with the assistance of mindfulness, introspection, attentiveness. What is my mind doing? What are my thoughts? Am I engaging in the 10 non-virtues? Am I benefiting myself and others or not? So that would be to subdue your mind. And then the next kind of the second interpretation of this verse would be to say, well, if you want to attain liberation, if you don't just want to be reborn in samsara again, but instead you realize, well, this existence has so many drawbacks, so many disadvantages. I want to get out. I want to get out of having this limited mind and body and transform my mind in particular into a mind that is described as liberated, free from fear, free from sadness, free from unnecessary dissatisfaction, and so forth. So all these states of mind that harm ourselves and, of course, indirectly also harm others. And how do we achieve that? Well, do not commit a single unwholesome action. Do not engage in actions. Well, get rid of the afflictive emotions, certain emotional states that not only induce the 10 non-virtues, which we should refrain from anyway, but also the mind to control, learn to control our mind in that we, well, first reduce our afflictive emotions, and then in the long term, we learn to eliminate those afflictive emotions. Cultivate excellent virtue, which are the antidotes to that. Remember, she talked about the 3 higher trainings in this context. So here in particular, morality, concentration, and wisdom. In particular, a type of wisdom that is a combination, that's a union of concentration or calm abiding and a special insight into reality. And based on that, eliminate the afflictive emotions. So that would be cultivate excellent virtue and completely subdue your mind in exactly that way, to work towards eliminating afflictive emotions and their seeds, that which, well, the potential for these afflictive emotions, anger, attachment, and so forth, the anger, attachment, and so forth, for them to disappear, but also for the potential for those afflictive emotions to arise again, to also remove that potential so that they can never arise in our mind again. That would be completely subdue your mind. And Rinpoche actually stopped there. He didn't continue. He didn't talk about then how to approach this from the point of view of the Mahayana, since that will be explained. Now, what did Rinpoche say? Having talked about explaining this verse just from the point of view of a person who has the objective to be liberated in a higher state, or who has the objective to be totally liberated from samsara, well, what is important to know here? Dependent arising. So I said, Rinpoche really talked about dependent arising. He said, well, we need to understand how we get from A to B. In dependence on this, we experience that. She started off with saying, well, what are these unwholesome actions? What are positive actions? What are negative actions? Why do we call them that? Well, from the point of view of what they give rise to. The result is suffering. If they cause suffering, an action that causes suffering is a non-virtuous, is a harmful action. An action that creates suffering, that creates happiness, that causes, well-being, especially in the long term, that is described as a virtuous action. Well, mainly from the point of view of the person, of course, executing that action, of engaging in that action. So from the point of view of a virtuous action, for instance, benefiting helping another person with the motivation to help them out of love and concern for that person, that will lead, with regard to myself engaging in that action, to a positive experience in the future. If, however, my motivation is negative, I engage in harmful action out of this negative motivation, the wish to harm someone, as a result of that, I will experience suffering. That's why I call it a positive or a negative action. Why? Because what do I want to be? I want to be happy. What I wish for is happiness. I want to be free from problems. I want to experience peace of mind. That's what we all wish. And those actions, that my own personal actions that create that, those are therefore called positive actions. And then with regard to those actions which destroy that peace of mind, they're called negative actions. So it's in relation to that. Okay. So therefore, what we need to know, and Rinpoche said there are a few things we now need to understand. How do we go about this? So these unwholesome actions that lead to suffering, well, what are their causes? Where do they arise from? What gives rise to these actions? How can we cultivate more positive actions? So Rinpoche said, well, we need to look at the causes. And again, dependent arising in the sense that in dependence on certain actions, we experience suffering, or we experience unwanted suffering, unwanted problems, or we experience peace of mind, we experience happiness, well-being. So independence on certain actions. Now, where do these actions come from? And Rinpoche said it a few times, actions of body and speech. But of course, these actions of body and speech are created, are induced by the mind. So by certain mental actions, ideas, thoughts, I want to harm that person, I want to benefit that person. So the motivation that gives rise to actions of body and speech, but also further than that, certain afflictive emotions, which in turn give rise to the thought, I want to harm this person, I want to take their money, or on the other hand, I want to give them something, so I want to be generous with them, and so forth. Therefore, Rinpoche said, so the result of suffering comes from certain actions of body, speech, and mind. And the mind itself, that is controlled by certain afflictive emotions. And it's all linked to the mind. Rinpoche was very clear on that. He said, everything we experience, it's all linked to the mind. The experiences we have on a daily basis, what we call happiness, what we call suffering, it's not the external situation. The external situation has an impact on our mind, but basically it's really what we experience with our mind. Do we feel good? I mean, the sun may be shining, it's wonderful outside. Rinpoche didn't say that, but to just give an example, well, everything may be perfect in terms of outside. The sun is shining, the birds are singing and so forth, and we feel miserable. So there's an experience of suffering, and the outside world has very little impact, or maybe no impact in that situation. And then, of course, on the other hand, everything may fall apart around us, and we're calm and peaceful and at ease. No suffering, no fear, and so forth. So again, the external has no influence on that. And of course, there are other situations where the external has an effect on our mind. But the point is here, and Rinpoche stressed that a lot, it's all linked to the mind. And so, well, being linked to the mind, of course, the causes, that which gives rise to these experiences, they're also linked to the mind. Therefore, it all comes down to our own mind, our own consciousness, and in particular emotions, specific emotions, afflictive emotions that give rise to actions of body and speech. And so these afflictive emotions are described as attachment and anger, and the whole other range of afflictive emotions such as arrogance, envy, etc. Now, those actions, they cause, so those states of mind, those negative states of mind, these afflictive emotions, cause us right away discomfort. And of course, they lead to actions that further harm us right here and now, harm others, and harm us in the future. But what is the cause of all this? Where does that come from? What is the cause for these afflictive emotions? And Rinpoche said they're twofold. There are two types of negative emotions, two states of mind that are responsible for all other afflictive emotions. One is self-grasping. It's an unrealistic or mistaken apprehension of reality, in particular with regard to how the I exists. And then from that unrealistic apprehension of reality, that grasping onto a self, an unrealistic self, not just grasping at a self in general, the self that does exist, but rather at a self that does not exist. So a type of mind that grasps at such a self, that then gives rise to self-centeredness. And those two minds, self-grasping and self-centeredness, those two minds are responsible for all other afflictive emotions. They are responsible for all our trouble. Okay. So therefore, what he said, let me just check. So all of Buddhism really revolves around these two states of mind. Understanding that we all have those states of mind, and Buddhism is all about recognizing them, giving us means, showing us methods to recognize them, and then to reduce them and eventually to totally overcome them. So I don't want to, I want to make sure I tell you everything that Rinpoche is saying. So, well, therefore, what Rinpoche said was basically you have this cause and effect chain where you have self-grasping first. That gives rise to self-centeredness. That gives rise to other afflictive emotions. That in turn leads to the types of actions we engage in, many of them non-virtuous kind of actions, and it leads to suffering. So in that way, I said, Rinpoche really talked about dependent arising, especially dependence on certain causes, which gives rise to certain results. And to stress it again, it's all dependent on the mind. And we are born already with a certain mind. And in that context, Rinpoche also gave a quote from The Blaze of Reasoning by Baba Viveka. He said, Baba Viveka explains in this text, Blaze of Reasoning, that children, of course, are raised by their parents, are influenced by their parents, but it's not like they're like a blank sheet. Rather, they're born with certain tendencies already. And so we can observe this, that certain children, when they're born, they may be very intelligent, they grasp things very quickly. So independent of how they're trained by their parents, they have certain propensities, they have certain abilities right away. And so Rinpoche said, well, because they were born with a mind that in a previous existence has already familiarized itself with certain ideas, was maybe the mind of a person who's very learned. And so we carry this from one life to the next. We carry on these propensities, which shows, well, we can familiarize our mind in a certain way. We can become more familiar. We can become familiar with ideas, so we can practice patience. Rinpoche mentioned when you have a problem with anger, you practice patience, for instance, and over time become more patient. And it's this continuum of mind that goes from one life to the next, having certain experiences and abilities, but in the end, we're all trapped within cyclic existence in the sense that we're all influenced by self-grasping and self-centered attitude. So it's important to understand that self-grasping is really the root of everything, and that we need to give the self-grasping special attention. So we need to understand that this is what benefits me, this is what harms me, but in particular, when it comes to self-grasping, we need to deal with this. What is that mind grasping at a self? Because everything we do, and Rinpoche explained this to a certain degree, he said, well, whatever we do all our experiences, attachment and so forth, it always goes back to what's good for me, what benefits me. I want this, I don't want that. So our entire life just revolves around I, me, and mine. And it shows, since there's this self-centeredness, as that is called, this being attached to the I, self-centered, just it all revolves around the I, that self-centered attitude, well, that is there because there's this basic misapprehension holding onto an I, an unrealistic view of the I. So that is a mind, and I previously already mentioned it. It doesn't just grasp at a self in general. That should be made very clear, because no one is saying that there is no self. This is extremely important, and it's easily misunderstood. Rinpoche hasn't talked about it yet, but I might as well stress it here in this context. So Buddhism is not saying that there is no I and that there is no self. That would be ludicrous. That'd be like saying we don't exist. There's just a body and a mind. But no one is saying that. We're saying that there's actually, there are persons, there are animals, there are humans, there are beings. There's I and there's you. However, our mind, the self-grasping mind, is not just grasping at an ordinary self. It gives the self a type of existence that exaggerates the actual conventional I, the I that does exist. And so how did Rinpoche explain it? Our mind perceives an inherent I based on the appearance of such an I. There's a sense that the I can be extracted from mind and body. Rinpoche actually did that gesture, like as if you could kind of open up your chest, take these minds, these different awarenesses that pop up in our mind and pop up in our mental continuum, and you could extract this I. So something solidly there, a self that can be found, a self as it's formulated in Tibetan that you can point at, something very specific. This is the I. That's the sense. This is how the I appears to us. Usually when we think I, in many situations, and depends on the situation, but throughout the day, there's a sense, there's this solid I. That's not the mind, that's not the body, something that, as just said, can be extracted from mind and body, something you can point at, something that's contained within mind and body. So based on that appearance, there's first that appearance, and then we hold on to it. That's self-grasping. And from self-grasping, there's a sense, there's the solid I, and then there's attachment to this. This is precious. This I is precious. So attachment to this, seeing this as more precious than anyone else's, than other people's I. All right. Therefore, what Rinpoche explained was, well, you get from the self-grasping to a sense, oh, this is more precious. From this unrealistic perception of an I, there's this extreme sense of, I'm so important, I'm the center of the universe. And then Rinpoche gave the example of the snake. And someone asked a question. I actually see her on the screen, but I forget her name now. Anyway, so she asked a question about how do you use this snake example? How do you use this example of the snake and the example of the rope in terms of the I? Well, might as well talk about it right now. That was the question asked towards the end. But in this context, actually, the example of the snake can be used in many different ways. And it is mentioned in the entry into the middle way, Lama Tsongkhapa, Chandra Kirti, he mentions it in his text. But explicitly, the way it is used in this text is to say, well, if you have a rope that is coiled together, speckled, so it looks like a snake, really it has great similarity with the body of the snake. So you may mistakenly label snake onto this rope. Okay, that's the example. Then if you take something else, you take, well, a car or a house or a person or an actual snake. Let's take the snake body. You label snake on the basis of an actual snake body. Now, the example with the coiled rope, which is actually not a snake, it's saying that just with this example, where you take a coiled rope and you label it snake, although mistakenly, but you still label snake, just as you won't find anything solid that's called a snake when you label it on the basis of rope and speckled rope. In the same way, you won't find something solid like a car labeled on the basis of, well, car parts, or labeled on the basis of my mind and body. I won't find a solid I, a solid person, Kelsang Wangmo. And even on a snake body, if I take a snake body and I label snake, I won't find some solid snake other than the snake that was labeled on its body. So in that way, the snake, the coiled rope, not being able to find a snake on the basis of that coiled rope is just like not being able to find an actual snake on the basis of a snake body. So that's the example how it's usually used. But Rinpoche used it slightly differently, which is also contained in Chandrakirti's text. He used it differently. He said, well, the example is clear of the snake. Now let's repeat the example just to be sure it's clear. So what is the basis for this mistaken apprehension? Okay. Rope is perceived as snake. A rope is not a snake, but it's still mistakenly perceived as a snake. And from that, then fear arises. We're scared of the snake. How did Rinpoche use it here as the example? Well, a merely labeled I, a merely conventionally existed I, is mistakenly seen to be a solid, inherently independent I, right? Just as the rope is mistakenly perceived to be an actual snake. So here, a merely labeled I, just called I on the basis of mind and body, is seen as a solid entity that can be extracted as separate from mind and body. Okay? And so just as this basis of a rope, which is mistakenly perceived to be a snake, gives rise to fear, in a similar way, here, when we perceive a self that's merely labeled, if then we perceive that merely labeled I to be solid, independent, separate from mind and body, we could actually point at that self. Well, that, if you perceive that, then naturally you feel attached to it. It's just a natural, that's just how the mind works. If you exaggerate that existence of the I, give it more of an existence that it actually has, just as you turn a rope into a snake. So if you actually perceive an inherent I based on a merely conventionally existent I, of course you're going to have attachment. And if you have attachment to the I, so attachment to the I is really just another way of saying self-cherishing or self-centeredness. What is attachment to the I? It's a mistaken type of mind that exaggerates the importance to I and therefore holds on to it, sees that which is beneficial to I as more important than that which is beneficial to others. Okay, so attachment to the I is really, self-centeredness is a form of attachment to the I. So that's what Rinpoche explained on the basis of this self-grasping. And he also used the example, he said, well, how do we know we have self-grasping? For instance, if someone hits us with a stick, he used the example with the stick. Actually, someone hits our arm. What really is hit, of course, is a piece of flesh. And that causes, well, a bruise, it causes pain. That's what really happens. However, because we also apprehend a separate entity that somehow pervades mind and body, on top of the pain we experience, there's a sense the I was hurt. So my arm was hurt, but also this pervasive I, which seems to be separate from I, mind, and body, as if you could extract it, but at the same time pervading mind and body. So it's this really contradictory kind of way of how we look at this I. It's separate, but then again, not separate. It's kind of can be extracted, but if you hit my arm, you hit me kind of thing. All right, so that kind of unrealistic way of looking at the I, there's a sense they hit me, and therefore we get angry. We don't get angry if we just perceive in a conventional I and there's an arm that got hit and it's bruised and that's it. There's nothing, there's no anger that can arise because there's no attachment to a self. And so without anger, it doesn't mean we just sit still and allow someone to hit us. No, we would try and do something about it, this physical harm, maybe try to convince them to not harm me and try and stop them in whichever way we can. I mean, in a gentle way, of course. I mean, Rinpoche didn't say that, but he said, first ask them, please stop. And if that doesn't help, well, let's just run away. Do something to get away from that pain. That's all right. But anger is an exaggerated reaction coming out of an exaggerated self-centeredness, or an exaggerated mind that is self-centeredness coming out of an exaggerated view of reality. All right. So what is Buddhism all about? Getting rid of this unrealistic mind. That's at the root. And it's also, of course, in that way, indirectly also concerned with getting rid of self-centeredness. But of course, if you get rid of self-grasping, you get rid of self-centeredness, since it has arisen from self-grasping. So some of the things I'm saying Rinpoche has said, some of them I'm just adding a little bit, you may notice. So it is therefore so important, if we want to be peaceful, if we want to be happy, free from fear, anxiety, depression, sadness, and all that, it's important to get rid of that unrealistic mind. So to understand, we're not, well, the unrealistic mind that perceives the self, and of course that then gives rise to a sense we're the center of the universe. And we're just simply not. I mean, first of all, and we'll deal with this as part of this text, of course, the I doesn't exist the way it appears to us, and that will become clearer. But also the view, the self-centered view, well, to believe we're more important than others, we're the center of the universe, well, that's totally unrealistic. What is it in fact? In fact, everyone is equally important. All other sentient beings are important. Everyone is the center of the universe. And it creates all our trouble. I mean, first of all, it's not realistic. I'm not the center of the universe. I mean, that's totally unrealistic. But what's worse is it creates all my problems. All my problems are the result of that self-centeredness and, of course, of its main cause. Whereas the opposite, to understand that all sentient beings are equally important, and out of that understanding, behaving in an appropriate way, well, it leads to all well-being, all happiness, any type of peace of mind that we can achieve, that we as living beings can actually achieve. All right. So, therefore, Rinpoche said, Buddhism refers to the methods of overcoming self-grasping and self-centeredness. All right. And Rinpoche also gave a quote from Dharmakirti's Pramanavartika. There are actually two verses. I'll translate them for you. Sorry, I didn't get around translating them yet. Well, I've course translation, but like a little bit more refined. Also, Rinpoche left out a few lines, which I'll just add. But just let me give you like a rough kind of explanation of the verse he quoted, or there's two verses actually. He said that, well, or Dharmakirti said, due to apprehending the self, literally seeing the self, due to seeing the self or apprehending the self, there's always attachment to the I. Okay, so again, due to self-grasping, there's always, once you have self-grasping, there is going to be attachment to the self. You can't get rid of self-centeredness or attachment to the I without getting rid of self-grasping or this unrealistic view of the I. Just no way. So there's always attachment to the I. That attachment, and here Rinpoche explained, he said this leads to attachment to not just the attachment to the I then gives rise to attachment to that which is mine. This is not what Dharmakirti says, but Rinpoche added that line, as in like it gives rise to attachment to my mind, my body, and then external objects, my possessions, and so forth. And then the text goes on to say that attachment to I and mine gives rise to craving for pleasure. So that attachment gives rise to craving for pleasure. So I want pleasant experiences. First of all, attachment to I, to mine, which is only implicitly mentioned in Dharmakirti's text. Rinpoche only mentioned it. And then that gives rise, that attachment to I and mine gives rise to craving for pleasure, craving for positive experiences. Anything that gives me pleasure, so I'm attached to it. What does that craving do? And the text goes on to say, that craving obstructs all the folds. So whatever I crave, because of my craving, so first I crave for happiness, and then I look around the objects around me, whatever I associate with happiness, this person gives me happiness. So I grow attached, I crave that person because, well, I crave happiness first of all, and believing this person gives me happiness, I crave that person. And depending on the craving, it obstructs me from seeing the faults of this person and only allows me to see the positive qualities of that person. And then Rinpoche left out the few lines, and he basically said, and that gives rise to samsara. So it goes on to say really that I do everything to take care of the I and to take care of that which is mine, basically, and that gives rise to samsara. So I engage in karmic actions thereafter, and well, that is responsible for existing in samsara. So I'll translate those two verses. I did work on the translation, or I am still working on the translation, but I didn't get that far. That's more towards the end, these two verses. And Rinpoche said these are really important. And really, just to summarize them again, before you get the translation, I'll make available and send it to Kumbin. But really just saying, first there's self-grasping, then there's attachment to I, and to attachment which is mine. That gives rise to craving for my happiness, my well-being. And whatever we associate with that happiness, that which gives me happiness, usually external objects, my mind is obstructed from seeing its faults. I only see positive qualities, I only see the positive of it, and now I'll run after it to achieve this for myself and I. And those leads to karmic actions of body, speech, and mind, and keeps me trapped in samsara, and of course causes all my problems. So these are two very beautiful verses that Rinpoche cited just before starting the texts. And with this, he then said, well, let's start the text. Now, I believe you have the text with you. Changkya Rölpai Dorjé's Recognizing the Mother, or as it's sometimes called, Recognizing My Mother. The full title is really a song on the experience of the middle way view. So a song in the sense it's a inspired song. It's not really sung in that way, like it's not like sing it in the form of a song, but like in the form of a poem. So it's just inspired by the experience that Changkya Rölpai Dorjé, the author, had, the experience of the middle way view. And that is expressed in this very beautiful text. And Rinpoche just had the time to talk. How are we with time? I've already spoken for an hour. Okay. So Rinpoche really just had time to start with the first verse. And Rinpoche said, well, the content of this text is really extensive. It doesn't have many verses. It's how many verses? 26, I believe. Let me check. Yeah, 26 verses. It's not very long, but its content is extremely extensive. And really, to understand it fully, you really need good knowledge of the Dharma. So there are different levels that your understanding is based on different levels of understanding. You need to actually have a good knowledge of the basis of Buddhism, and to totally fully understand it, even knowledge of the way emptiness is set forth in the other traditions of Buddhism. Well, first of all, in the four philosophical systems, Vaibhashika, Satantrika, Chittamatra, and Madhyamika. What is the view in terms of the I and other phenomena according to those philosophical systems? And then on top of that, the different traditions within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. So not just the Gilo tradition, but what is also briefly, just briefly mentioned, is the Nyingma, Kagyu, and Sakya tradition. Only briefly mentioned, but to fully understand what the author is saying, it would be good to have knowledge of the way they set forth emptiness on top of the knowledge, the general knowledge you should have. So really, to understand it fully, you should have a full understanding, at least of the emptiness as it sets forth in the different philosophical schools and different traditions. Okay. Anyway, but still, we start where we are. We take it from where we are. And so what does this text teach us? It teaches us what is the middle way. Again, what do all the tenet systems say? And why do we not realize the middle way? What is the reason for not realizing it? What is the way other traditions set it forth? What is the view they explain? And how is it possible to miss the highest view? So Rinpoche just kind of gave all these kind of different, well, it just summarized it in that way, saying, how could you miss the highest view? Or how did the author come to understand the view? So he just kind of made these statements. That's what this text, Recognizing the Mother, actually presents. Okay, so what is the middle way view? How to come to understand it? What's the problem if you miss it? How can you miss it? What do other tenet systems say about it? What do other Tibetan traditions say about it? And so forth. All right. And then Rinpoche just briefly went over it. He said, well, the first verse is an expression of worship or homage, paying homage, and promising to compose the text. And then Rinpoche gave a little bit more explanation on that. But he also said what comes through in these following verses. And as you're probably aware, the commentary that Rinpoche actually uses is by Geshema Wangmo. This commentary, I've made it available. It has already been published. I have an e-copy of that. I send it to Kumben. You can have the Tibetan of that. So I have the Tibetan root text by Changkya Rölpai Dorjé, and I have the commentary by Geshema Wangmo. And Rinpoche will base his following explanation on that commentary. But in English, well, the text has been translated by Thupten Jinpa, and there's a rough draft of the commentary available by Jeffrey Hopkins. But he himself writes in there, until this part, I checked the texts, and it's a little bit different from Thupten Jinpa's translation. So I guess it's a draft, but it's made available. So when we prepared this text for translation for His Holiness, we all had this, well, we got the commentary actually towards the end, at least the English translation, but maybe it's available to you. I'm not sure. Anyway, Rinpoche will explain it anyway, so even if you don't have it, hopefully it'll become clear. But Rinpoche just roughly went over this text, and especially the beginning is not really based on the commentaries so much, but still that was just Rinpoche just glancing over it. So Rinpoche basically said this text was composed by Changkya Rölpai Dorjé based on his understanding. And then the text describes the faults of not understanding this text. So he said about 3 verses describe the faults of not realizing it. So I'm not really sure, because I went through it again, and what exactly, because in a way it's many verses implicitly talk about the faults of not realizing emptiness, but it'll become clear as Rinpoche goes along. But anyway, so there are some verses that describe the faults of not realizing emptiness. One verse talks about the benefits of realizing emptiness. Then there's some verses that talk about how to overcome samsara, our limited existence that we find ourselves in. Then, of course, there are a few verses that talk about the meaning of emptiness and dependent arising, especially those two. And which teachings did the author himself rely on? That is particularly verse 9. And then verse 10, 11, 12. And like I said, it's just a short overview. Rinpoche didn't mention the page numbers, but from what Rinpoche said, the verse numbers. Some of the verses I found, with some verses, I'm not sure which verses Rinpoche meant, because he didn't number them. But anyway, verse 10, 11, and 12, Rinpoche mentioned in particular in the Gelugpa tradition, what can be the problem in the Gelugpa tradition, which is one of the Tibetan Buddhist traditions, holding on to words more than focusing on the meaning behind it. So Changkya Rölpai Dorjé is basically warning, giving a warning, and especially those following the Gelugpa tradition, don't get caught up in the words. Okay, and then he also sets forth in verse 13 and 14, he talks about the other philosophical systems, not particular to the Tibetan tradition, but in general, as they were taught by the Buddha. So what do they assert when it comes to the I, when it comes to the final view? Just a short overview, verse 13 and 14. 15 and 16, it talks about, in particular, the other Tibetan Buddhist traditions. And kind of says there, you also have to be careful not to miss the point. I mean, just warning ordinary sentient, ordinary human beings who follow these views, not of course the great lamas who've understood completely what these traditions set forth, but just ordinary people saying, well, you listen to these teachings, but make sure you don't miss the point. So whether it is the Kagyu, Nyingma, Sakya, or Gelug tradition, we all have to be careful to really see what's behind the teachings that are given. Okay, and then the text goes on to refute some of the philosophical schools as set forth by the Buddha, saying why they are missing the view. And of course, then how did the author realize? How did he realize? How did Changkya Rölpai Dorjé himself realize the view? How he came to that understanding? So really, that's what this text is all about, and you'll of course learn more about it rather than the few words that I just mentioned. And then at the very end, of course, the author remembers the kindness of Nagarjuna of Lama Tsongkhapa, of his own personal teacher. So teaching on Chögyен was his own teacher, the tutor of the 7th Dalai Lama, and the 7th Dalai Lama himself. He was also the teacher of Changkya Rölpai Dorjé. So he remembers their kindness. He dedicates the virtue he's accumulated and generates joy expressed in the form of a song. So again, kind of this is expressed, well, the whole text is expressed in the form of a song, but he expresses the joy again, giving this teaching. Okay, so that was just a brief overview. Rinpoche went through it quite quickly. But then he started with verse 1. So the first verse, he talks about, well, paying homage. This is so strange for us. It's a style of writing that we just don't have. I mean, who pays homage at the beginning of a text? I mean, even religious texts for the traditions, like for instance, Christianity, Judaism, Islam. I'm not sure that all these, I don't know many Christian texts, or I don't know, except for the Bible maybe, but anyway, so these different religious texts, do they start with worship, with a verse of honor or some of homage? Well, I don't think so. So this is very typical Tibetan. It's something you find in the Tibetan tradition, in particular in the Nalanda tradition, which also, well, the Tibetan Buddhist tradition follows. So here, Rinpoche mentions that the different treatises, the different commentaries, 99%, he said, start with such a praise or like an homage to someone, to something. It can be to a person, to one's Lama, to the Buddha, Bodhisattvas, but even to great compassion or dependent arising. So it can be prayer, it can be homage to something. And it's really, and Rinpoche kind of puts it, it's kind of difficult to translate this word that Rinpoche used. He used the word yarap, actually quoting from Maitreya's differentiating between the middle way and the extreme. So there's a text by Maitreya called Differentiating Between the Middle Way and the Extremes. That's the name of this text. And a commentary on that. Rinpoche didn't mention the author on this commentary, but in a commentary on Maitreya's text, it says that, well, it gives the reason for why such a praise, such a worship at the beginning should be mentioned. And it really just said it's the decent thing to do, or yarap, as in Tibetan, yarap, it's, well, if you look it up in the dictionary, it says polite, That's a polite thing to do, but polite here, it's a well-mannered thing to do, or it's a righteous, it's a decent thing to do, it's appropriate. In other words, well, to kind of pretend it's all us, we just had all this knowledge on our own, and we came, whatever understanding we have, and in the case of this author, like Changkya Rölpai Dorjé, to kind of pretend, well, I was just born with this knowledge, I had it naturally, and I didn't need anyone, I just came up with this on my own. That would be arrogant. Rinpoche didn't use these words, but it would be inappropriate. It would not be decent to do so. So it's really just, I guess, and Rinpoche didn't say that, but it's like an antidote to arrogance. Oh, this is just me, I have this understanding. But rather, no. What I'm going to talk about here now, and this is again Rinpoche's words, this text below, where did I get that understanding from? And then you express this worship or homage. So if it's your teacher, you mention your teacher. If it's through the teachings on dependent arising or whatever, you mention those. So in this case here, Changkya Rölpai Dorjé mentions his lamas, his spiritual teachers, and paying homage to them. So Rinpoche stressed this. This is appropriate. This is righteous. This is a decent kind of thing to do. Remember the sense of gratitude, where you got this from. And there are other reasons, not just because it's decent, a decent, righteous thing to do, to pay homage, but also in other texts it's explained, it helps you to complete the text. There's this kind of humility, paying homage. It's also virtue accumulated. You inspire others through these words of homage. You're more successful in your practice through this humility. You receive the blessings of one's Lama, the blessings of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and so forth. All right. But how does this worship, how is this expressed? And Rinpoche read the first 3 lines, so I don't need to read it here. But he said, well, it's expressed by saying, I pay homage, or my kind gurus, they're so incredible, basically saying. But he's not just saying, well, you're amazing. What the author is saying, what you taught is so amazing. You're amazing. Your kindness is boundless. Your kindness to me is boundless because of what you taught. And what is that? Dependent arising. It's extremely profound dependent arising. So when you look at the commentary, then it says, well, what does profound mean? Profound means it's difficult to understand. It's difficult to understand. And then Rinpoche talked about the fact that, well, yeah, dependent arising emptiness, that is really difficult to understand. Why? Due to self-grasping. Rinpoche didn't say that, but that's the reason. It's due to self-grasping. We find emptiness, dependent arising, those concepts are really difficult. And the Buddha himself knew, of course, that when he first attained enlightenment, well, this is extremely difficult to teach. And so he didn't teach right away. And that was a teaching in itself that the Buddha didn't teach right away. Why? Because he, in a sense, understanding that this is really profound. And the fact that the Buddha didn't teach right away tells us this is not something we can just, read through it once and then understand it. I mean, any kind of teaching, in particular on dependent arising and emptiness, that is really difficult, and we need to spend time with it. We need to make an effort to really gain an understanding. And Rinpoche just mentioned this one line, so I shall remain silent here in the forest. Rinpoche just gave that line, but actually there's a quote that His Holiness gives again and again. It's from the Lalita Vistara Sutra. It goes, profound and pacified, free from fabrications, uncompounded luminosity, I found a nectar-like Dharma. Yet if I were to teach it, no one would understand. So I shall remain silent here in the forest. So with this, according to His Holiness interpretation, the Buddha is really saying, I've got these 3 wheels of Dharma. I'm going to teach. But right now, it's too profound. I'll remain for a while. It's still too profound for people to understand. So I'll teach it when the time has come, kind of thing. And then it's been explained that the Buddha remained for 5 weeks before teaching. And I guess, and this has also been explained, not by Rinpoche, but on different occasions, that then the time was ripe. People's karma had become such that now People were able, whatever they had done previously was now enough for the Buddha to come and teach and give a teaching that was effective. But with these words, when Rinpoche talked about this, he's saying that, well, it shows it's so profound what is taught here. Because selflessness, that's what's taught, is here. It's the highest view, and it's the most important view in the sense that it's that understanding of which enables us to get rid of the root of all our problems. And so Rinpoche also says that, well, His Holiness usually talks about it, mentioning that a Lama has taught emptiness is not enough. It's important to also mention that a Lama has taught dependent arising. So when you praise a Lama, praising this Lama in terms of saying this Lama has taught dependent arising, it's really important to stress that, because that's so important. And as Rinpoche puts it, I couldn't right away come up with the word. It's the amalaki berry, actually. What Rinpoche said, or gooseberry, as Thupten Jinpa translates it. Actually, it's quite interesting because His Holiness always quotes 3 verses at the end of the 6th chapter. The 6th chapter of the Entry into the Middle Way by Chandrakirti. Very often, I think it was the last teaching His Holiness again gave a quote of these 3 last verses. That's verse 224, 225, 226 of the 6th chapter. Again and again, His Holiness quotes it. And this amalaki berry is part of this particular of these particular 3 verses. And well, Rinpoche said, actually, Yangten Rinpoche said, well, the Lama is so kind. The Lama is like, what happens is that it's very difficult to understand dependent arising. That was taught by the Buddha. So now Rinpoche didn't put it into those words, but that's really the meaning of it. Rinpoche literally said, what does the Lama do? It's like he's handing us dependent arising like a gooseberry. He's handing us this gooseberry on his hand. So it's not immediately clear what is meant with this. So whether you call this berry a gooseberry or an amalaki berry, the point is here, I think it relates to this verse 224, when Chandrakirti says, thus illuminated by the rays of wisdom's light, the bodhisattva sees as clearly as a gooseberry on his open palm that the 3 realms in their entirety are unborn. They're inherently not existent from their start. Okay, so they are unborn from their very start. And through the force of conventional truth, he journeys to cessation. So in other words, the bodhisattva comes to realize emptiness, and it clearly appears to him like a gooseberry, which is kind of transparent. This kind of amalaki berry is transparent, and you can clearly see inside. Okay, you can clearly see what's inside. So it's with this clarity, as if it was lying, as if dependent arising was lying on the hand of the bodhisattva, emptiness was lying on the hand of the bodhisattva. The bodhisattva, or any realized being, well, also an arhat, of course, but here in particular, since it's a Mahayana text, it mentions a bodhisattva aiming for enlightenment, sees dependent arising, emptiness clearly as this gooseberry. And so what Yangten Rinpoche said is, the Lama teaching us dependent arising is really like handing us this gooseberry and says, here it is. In the sense that the Buddha taught dependent arising, yes, of course, but it was taught in a different style 2,500 years ago. I mean, if you read the Heart Sutra and you hear there's no eye, no ear, no nose, you go, what? Form is empty, emptiness is form. Unless someone explained it to you, it's not directly obvious to us. And the emptiness as it's explained nowadays is very different to the style of teaching that you had, well, even 500 years ago, as apparent from the style of writing sometimes. So therefore, a Lama is someone, of course, we're talking about a realized Lama, who through his own or her own understanding, so in the case of Changkya Rölpai Dorjé, really, handing us, through his own understanding, handing us this gooseberry, as in like, look, this is what I understood, here's my explanation. So it's made it so much easier to understand. And therefore, our Lama, so His Holiness the Dalai Lama, for instance, puts it into his own words and passing on to us dependent arising, so that it's really just giving us this gooseberry, and based on that we understand clearly. Anyway, so maybe I shouldn't have mentioned it that extensively, but I thought it was quite interesting, especially in connection to His Holiness always giving this quote, or frequently giving this quote. But Rinpoche mentioned other aspects. So he said Nagarjuna's praise to Dharmadhatu, or commentary of Bodhicitta. He wasn't sure which text it was. It also mentions dependent arising. It's so wondrous, it's marvelous, it's amazing. And here this text also says it's the wonder of profound dependent arising. So again, yes, just to remind you, here the author praises his own teacher by way of mentioning he is taught dependent arising. It's profound, difficult to understand, and it's a wonder. And the commentary then, and Rinpoche also explains, it's a wonder in the sense that, well, dependent arising deals with the appearances of phenomena. When we say emptiness, lack of inherent existence, is only explaining us how things do not exist. But dependent arising explains us how they exist. Because emptiness is not about non-existence. It's not saying nothing exists, but rather it's talking about a certain type of existence that is not possible. But we also need to know, how do things actually exist? And here, what the commentary says, when what Rinpoche also says, is how they appear. Phenomena appear, although they lack inherent existence. And although they lack, and despite them lacking inherent existence, they can still appear. So that's really wondrous, that though they don't exist inherently, we still perceive them. We can interact with phenomena. In fact, we can only interact with them because they don't exist inherently. And for our mind, that's incredible. It's truly wondrous, since we believe it's the opposite. We believe things function because they exist inherently. But in fact, they couldn't exist that. They couldn't function. They existed in that way. So it's amazing. Dependent arising explains how things don't exist inherently and how it's still possible that they do exist. So actually, and remember she didn't mention that, but he did implicitly, it did say, therefore dependent arising helps you to get rid of the extreme of nihilism and the extreme of reification. Okay, the two extremes that we usually fall into, believing there's nothing there, and one extreme, or phenomena exist the way they appear to us, independently, solidly, truly. Okay, so that's wondrous. Okay, and then he goes on to say, so you who reveals, bear clearly, Rinpoche didn't mention that, but in the commentary it says clearly, the wonder, I just explained why it's wondrous, of profound dependent arising nature. Okay. Oh my Guru, your kindness is boundless indeed. So he's saying he's not just kind. The Guru is not just kind, or spiritual master is not just kind, but his kindness, in this case, is his. It's just a few men, basically. I mean, who were the spiritual teachers of the author, Changkya Rölpai Dorjé. So it's their kindness is boundless. The spiritual master's kindness is boundless. Why? Because, and here's which says, well, we usually believe someone is kind if they give us some food, for instance. So we do believe they're kind. They've given us something helpful, but that kindness is limited in that we eat it and it's gone, and it doesn't benefit us for many centuries to come, if you like. But dependent arising is different. The benefit of dependent arising, the kindness of someone teaching us dependent arising, is boundless. If you think about it, what is my biggest problem? Suffering. Suffering is my biggest problem. Where does suffering come from? From karmic actions. Where do they come from? Karmic actions, well, they come from afflictive emotions. Where do afflictive emotions come from? Attachment to the I, or craving for happiness. To cite Dharmakirti, craving for happiness comes from attachment to I and attachment to mine. Where does attachment to I come from? Self-grasping. How do I get rid of self-grasping, and therefore of all the other problems that arise and end up in suffering? through understanding dependent arising and emptiness. So someone who teaches us is truly, his or her kindness is truly boundless, in the sense that, well, it benefits me for all times to come if I really put it into practice. Of course, that's what I need to do. But if I really put this into practice, and thereby I'm able to remove my self-grasping, and I'm able to remove all my problems, my anxiety, my fear, my dissatisfaction, the whole scope of problems, well, that is truly, it's boundless. The benefit is boundless. And if in the end I attain full enlightenment, the full enlightenment of a Buddha, also based on the understanding of dependent arising, well, that is truly amazing. It's a boundless benefit. And so again, it's stressed here, boundless is important. All right. Anyway, so dependent arising, therefore, is so important. And as I said in the beginning, really, Rinpoche's explanation is all based on that. I mean, he talks about dependence in particular from the point of view of that gives rise to that, that gives rise to that, or this result was created by that cause, which in turn came from this cause, which in turn, so implicitly, all the explanation Rinpoche has given up to this point is already based on dependent arising. Rinpoche then also gave a few quotes. Unfortunately, I couldn't so quickly translate some of these bits. They just got lost in translation. You may have noticed Rinpoche speaks really quickly. And so, yeah, unfortunately, there are advantages and disadvantages of direct translation, alternate translation. I have a hard time making up my mind what's better. Things always get lost in translation. But here, for instance, this verse from the Praise to Dependent Arising, Rinpoche went through it quickly. So what he said was, well, that's verse 21 of Praise to Dependent Arising, this text by Lama Tsongkhapa. It's a beautiful text. His Holiness quotes it all the time. It was also translated into English. What is more amazing than this? What is more marvelous than this? If one praises you in this manner, this is real praise, otherwise not. So praising dependent arising, it's marvelous, it's amazing. And also Nagarjuna mentions that the greatest generosity is the giving of dependent arising. And also among the many great teachers, the teacher of dependent arising is said to be the greatest. Okay, so, and again, it's also there's a verse that Rinpoche mentioned, that's verse 37 of, again, the same text by Lama Tsongkhapa, praise or in praise to dependent arising, sometimes it's called in praise to dependent origination. And the quote is, among teachers, the teacher of dependent origination, amongst wisdoms, the knowledge of dependent origination, you who are the most excellent, like the kings in the world, know this perfectly well, not others. So he praises the Buddha for having taught this, but really he praises dependent arising. And actually these words from verse 37 that I just gave you are actually a quote from Nagarjuna himself. So he just quoted Nagarjuna in this verse 37 by really just repeating what Nagarjuna has said. And so it becomes so obvious that dependent arising is so important. And this verse here, the first verse should inspire us. I want to learn more about it. So you read this and you already are ready to now hear the rest of the text. You're curious. What is this all about? I want to learn about it. I want to get rid of all my problems. I want to get rid of all the trouble that really comes from my own mind. I'm the only person I can do something about it. And the solution is the understanding of dependent arising and, of course, emptiness. And many texts, Rinpoche also mentioned Nagarjuna's main work, which is called Mula Madhyamika Karika, or Fundamental Wisdom. It starts with praising dependent arising. All right, so this is how far Rinpoche got, actually. That was all Rinpoche talked about. Yes, that's a summary of everything Rinpoche said. I hope I didn't confuse you with what I just repeated, what I just went through. Let me just think. There's also, of course, some of the questions that you asked. I think that was pretty clear. My apologies again, because first of all, I had a hard time, but I got used to Rinpoche speaking quite quickly. That was easier, but the volume was also a bit of an issue. Not because the volume was too low per se, but I could hear myself talk, not through my microphone, but just in general. And when usually doing other translations for His Holiness, for instance, then the volume is always really high up, so the translators can adjust it. And I hope we can solve this, putting up the volume a little bit, and I can give you more of what Rinpoche said. Yeah, and make sure I give more of the quotes and so forth. But anyway, with regard to the questions, 2 questions were asked. The first question, I think I've already, I went over it again. The second question was actually quite similar about self-grasping. I forget now, but anyway, if you still have further questions, we still have time, so we can now, well, take some questions. Please go ahead. I don't know, Kumbin, how you want to.
So if you have any questions, please raise your little yellow virtual hand, which you find in your Zoom menu. Just have a look where your Zoom menu is. Either if you're like me on iPad, it's up in the corner, or usually I think it's on the bottom somewhere, I'm guessing. And then your yellow virtual hand. I think most people by now are familiar with Zoom. So let's see. First is Jackie. Yes, Jackie, I will try. Please unmute.
Hello. I know you spoke about this once, about your arm being hit. So I wasn't quite clear. If you understand emptiness, do you feel the pain when someone hits your arm, or how does it not bother you? Because you're not. Sorry, I just don't understand how you would act if you were enlightened and someone hit you.
Okay, great. Well, let me repeat your question, Jackie, just to be sure I understand it. So your question is basically, well, once you understand emptiness, you wouldn't be bothered by someone hitting your arm, but how would you react nonetheless? Okay, very important question. I think it's not that simple to explain it, because there are different levels of a person in terms of having realized emptiness, for instance, for the first time, having conceptually realized it, then having directly realized it, and then having directly realized and having eliminated after having become familiar with that direct experience of emptiness, then having slowly eliminated all the afflictive emotions and now attained liberation, or having even eliminated more than just the afflictive emotions, the residues, the imprints that were left by those, and having attained the fully enlightened state of a Buddha. I think the reaction would be different depending on the person. All right. Now, Rinpoche didn't go into the sequence, but in basically what Rinpoche said was, with this example, he just said, well, why are we angry? Why do we get angry when someone hits us? We only get angry because there's self-grasping. We don't get angry because of the pain itself. We get angry with the I that is being harmed. Therefore, as long as we hold on to an I that is being harmed, as long as there's self-grasping and therefore attachment to the I, there will be anger or at least resentment when someone harms us. Okay, and so does that mean we should just allow someone to hit us? No. And with the remaining explanations, she said no. Our getting angry is an extreme reaction out of an extreme view regarding ourselves, which is attachment, coming out of an extreme view or an exaggerated extreme view of self-grasping. But there is a non-extreme, there is a sensible reaction, which would be, and Rinpoche just said it in general, well, to say stop it gently and maybe even strongly. I mean, Rinpoche said kuchi kuchi, which means in Tibetan, please stop. Right? It's like translating. Say kuchi kuchi, and if that doesn't help, you may just run away, for instance. But no, I mean, you could just say no, please stop it. And if that doesn't work, even harshly, and maybe even hold onto their hands or run away. Yes, but without the anger, without the resentment. And now, depending on the level of a person, for instance, well, I guess it's similar, if you like. I mean, once you get rid of, well, if you realize emptiness, let's put it that way. If you realize emptiness, but you haven't eliminated the afflictive emotions, already you'll be able much better to think also of the other person, not just put yourself, so the anger will be reduced, let's put it that way. There won't be the same amount of anger. I mean, look around, some people who are really self-centered, the slightest harm, you push them on the street, they go like, how dare you, right? They get really upset. And there are others that are much more mellow, right? And the more a person practices, the more patient they are, right? So there's definitely a certain understanding, intellectual understanding of emptiness, certain grasp of emptiness, and then that gets deeper until there's a realization. And then depending on the degree of compassion also you develop, well, your reaction will be motivated by the understanding there is no such an I, but that the other person, him or herself, harms him or herself, kind of hitting you. So to stop that person, driven by compassion. So now, without going into the different levels, you're liberated, you're enlightened, but really what happens is, instead of I'm the center of the universe, all sentient beings are in the center of the universe. And yeah, this living being is also important. And if it gets bruised and if it gets worse than that, this being may actually die and I won't be able to benefit other sentient beings. So my health is important in the sense that I have to take care of other sentient beings. So I take care of my own health. But again, long-term goal is other sentient beings. And also the person hitting me, they're not benefiting themselves, they're actually harming me. And again, if there's, I'm saying me, but if I was hypothetically like a bodhisattva, if I was a highly realized being, I would say, please don't do this to yourself. In other words, I would stop them for their own sake, right? So it's really like, I would stop the harm for myself, because I'm not saying I'm totally unimportant, I don't have the right to exist. That's not the case. It's important as a living being. I need to be healthy and so forth. If I'm a bodhisattva, I need to work for all sentient beings. I need to be healthy and strong to do that. So I'm important and I need to keep alive and keep myself from harm. But at the same time, also look after other sentient beings. So both give rise to the same reaction. Stop that person from harming another person and therefore harming themselves. That would be the reaction. Jackie, does that answer your question? Okay, great. All right, thank you. Next question.
Next one will be Anita. Anita G, can you please unmute yourself?
Yeah, please.
Hi, Venerable.
Hi.
My question is on the rope as the snake.
Mm-hmm.
So there are two things. There's a rope as a snake and snake as snake.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So the Svatantrikas would say the rope as snake is mistaken, but the snake as snake is not, because there's a valid basis on what you would label as snake. It bites you, you can die. There is something there that is a snake. Right? So then, but the Prasangikas say no, that even that, there's no valid basis on the conventional level or ultimate level, of course, but on the conventional level either, right? So how would they explain it? I mean, when you say that nothing solid as a snake is there even on a snake?
All right, let me just try and summarize your question to make sure I understand it correctly. Now, your question concerns, again, the snake, labeling snake on the basis of a rope and on the basis of an actual snake body. Now, there are two higher systems, two philosophical systems. The highest is called the Prasangika, and one school a little lower than that is the Svatantrika. Now, the Svatantrika, what would they say? In the case of labeling a snake on the basis of a rope, well, yeah, it's just a mistaken designation. But when we say snake based on an actual snake body, there's really something, there's an inherent snake there. There must be an inherent snake, because otherwise anything could be a snake. That is the Svatantrika view, which is slightly lower than the Prasangika view. In the Prasangika school, as you just said, well, they use this example of the snake because their view is different to the Svatantrika that was just explained, that there was something inherent. The Prasangika says, no, there's nothing inherent there. In the same way as when you label on the basis of a rope, you label snake, and there's no snake to be found. Also, when you label on the basis of a snake body, when you label snake, there's also no snake found. So how do they, and your question then is, how do they talk about a snake? Is that your question? Okay, great. So that's the question. All right. So how exactly? The Prasangika is saying, and I repeat this again because it's really important. Take the example of a coiled rope. I'm looking around whether I have anything I can use, nothing to use to show you as a coiled rope anywhere in my vicinity. No, nothing. So if you let's visualize this coiled rope that's lying in your garage, okay? It's a little dark. And now you label snake. And you put on the light and you realize that there was no snake. There was no snake. It feels like there's a real snake. When you label, there's a feeling, wow, snake. There's this object snake, as if the snake is kind of saying, hey, I'm a snake, right? From its own side. Okay. But you can't find a snake. But actually, the Prasangika says, well, when you take an actual snake body, okay, that let's say there was an actual snake body, there's an object we call snake is lying in your garage. And now you take that object, which actually is conventional, which we would call a snake. We don't call a rope snake, but an object that we call snake. If you now look for that snake, again, you don't find a snake. That's what the Prasangika says. But then how come you have a snake in one case and you don't have one in the other case? How conventionally can you talk about it? Because as we just heard, can't find a snake in both cases. Very important question and really difficult. I mean, Rinpoche will definitely talk more about it. And from my very, very limited, I can't even say understanding, but from the very little that I grasp, I'll just share my own understanding of that. With regard to an object, well, let's take a car. It's easier just to talk about parts of a car. A real functioning car and a non-functioning car, right? It's like the snake and the rope. The rope doesn't function as a snake. So let's take an example of the car just because it's easier to describe the parts. Let's say you have a car that's actually, it looks like a car, but it doesn't have an engine, it doesn't drive. So it's actually not a car. It's just made of wax, for instance, right? And then you have an actual car. You can take the same example. Just as when you label car on that object that's just made of wax and it can't even roll back and forth, doesn't have functioning wheels, just as that is not a car, likewise, there's, I don't know, there's Mercedes or whatever. This Mercedes is not a car. It's not found to be a car. So how can you talk about this? How can you say that? Well, for the simple reason, if this object that we usually call car wasn't a car in and of itself, because the Prasangika school doesn't say it's not a car at all. It's just saying that being a car is totally dependent on the mind. Being a car, we do label it a car, but that's dependent on the mind. If there was no one to label it a car, it wouldn't be a car, right? The other object, you may label it or not, but it's incorrectly labeled, because when we say we needed to label it, we need to designate, you need a person, you need a mind designating it. This doesn't happen randomly. We're not just going around and saying, oh, today I call this a car and that a cow, and this is a pen over there. And tomorrow I call it something different. That's not what labeling is all about. Labeling comes with consistency, And labeling comes with, very important, a certain basis of labeling, basis of imputation. So what does our mind do? Really, how does our mind work? There are certain appearances, things appear to us, right? Such as the parts of a car, and assembled in a certain way. It can be used in a certain way. And again, not on its own. There's a person using it, and then it can be driven and so forth. So it has a certain function. And based on all those parts, I now call this a car, right? There's a basis of imputation, performs a certain function, and I call it a car, and other people do too. And from then onwards, we could say it's a car. Okay, we have a concept of a car. But is this a car? If there was no one to label, if there's no one to label it car, would it be a car? No. It's not like it's got some kind of carness within it. A car dash ness, a car-ness, like being, it's got nothing that says car. I just took this object, right? My mind and other people's mind, we perceive these appearances of certain aspects, and then I label it car. And that's it. The same is true for me as myself. So car is much easier. Person is much harder because I'm not obsessed. I don't even have a car, so I'm definitely not obsessed with a car. But with myself, I'm obsessed with myself, you know, haircut and robes. I'm still totally obsessed. And when Rinpoche says, I feel like I'm the center of the universe, of course I feel that all the time. So why do I feel I'm the center of the universe? Because I perceive this I. Now, this seems to be so, it's the owner. Okay, so actually this is something that I didn't have the time to translate yesterday. Rinpoche said the word I in Tibetan, it is spelt in a way, the syllable da is called da. It is spelled in the same way as the word owner, dakpo, yeah. So you add a po and put the word self, and that's the word owner. That's why Rinpoche said the I is the owner. Okay, the I, so I only had time to say the I is the owner, and not saying all in Tibetan it's actually dakpo is spelled like pao, dakatak, and so forth. There's no time to say that. But the point is here, really, I have a sense there's this owner. There's this I controlling mind and body, and it's in charge. But really, what is it that's thinking? For instance, I feel like I have to control my mind now. What is really thinking? I have to control my mind. The mind. The mind is thinking, I have to control my mind. And the mind is thinking, I should walk now. And my legs are that which move, well, the motivation to walk somewhere, and then my legs carrying me there. So based on this interplay of all these aspects working together, different awarenesses, generating a motivation, that motivation gives a signal to the brain, and the brain gives signal to parts of the body. So there's nothing that's in charge. It's just doing its thing. Rinpoche spoke about neuroscientists. He talks about how neuroscientists have tried to find this controlling center in the brain, that which controls everything else. And they couldn't find it. It's just this interplay, interaction of different aspects, and they all work perfectly fine without a controller. My mind and body, they work perfectly fine with each other. And still, I believe there's an I that controls everything. And so what is the I? It's merely labeled. When my arm writes, I say I write. There's no separate I that in the back somewhere writes as well while my hand is writing. Or when my legs walk, I say I walk. I label it on the basis of the movement of my legs. And if my mind has a thought, I say I think. It feels like there's a mind thinking and there's an I thinking, and they're both doing it together. And all Buddhism is not denying the fact that you can label I on the mind or the body. When mind and body do something, you just label I on that. So that labeled I is there, but something more separate, something more than that, in that the mind is thinking and the I is also thinking. Well, that doesn't exist, right? That's what the Prasangika denies. But that's so difficult to understand, because for us, an I is exactly that inherent I. You deny the inherent I, you deny the I, and therefore we feel there's nothing there. Okay, Anita, does that help?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. All right. Then please, Del or Kumbinda, right? Am I right?
Yes, yes.
Right with the order? I just went.
Let me just unmute her. Yeah, Del, can you unmute yourself, please?
Del? D-E-L-L? Yes, there you are.
Jaipal Paliwal, is I and ego are same?
Oh, Del is probably the name of the computer. Say again, sorry?
Is I, I and the ego?
Ah.
You know, they are they the same, or I mean, how do you differentiate? Or?
That's actually a good question. I mean, ego is just the Latin word for I believe, right? It's just isn't that Latin? If someone could just nod, because I don't know. I think it's ego is Latin, right? Yeah, Kumpa knows. So ego is just the Latin word for I. It's just another language, and it means I, self. But it's often used in a way, ego is sometimes used to describe the mind that grasps at the I. Or it's just sometimes self-centeredness is described as the ego. So the word is just not used, it's just used in a slightly different way. And if we're aware of that, this guy has a big ego, right? It's like, this person has a big self. I mean, no, it's a merely labeled self. They may have a big body, but the mind cannot be big. So, mind doesn't have a size. So to say they have a big ego, what are you talking about? They have a big body or what? The merely labeled I doesn't have a size, right? It's only the basis of imputation that we can say is big. So therefore, a big ego really means strong self-centeredness. A big ego is another way of saying this person has strong self-centeredness. Okay, therefore, ego literally means I, but in the Buddhist context, and it's not just the Buddhist context, because in Tibetan there's no equal to that. It's, I think, the Western way of talking, the Western way of speaking. It's taken from the Western way of saying, oh, this guy has a huge ego. We took this and brought it into the Buddhist context. And here, as I said, to repeat myself, so it's not saying that the I is big, it's saying the self-centeredness, which is attachment to the I, that is strong. All right. So therefore, to answer your question, in a certain context, ego means self-centeredness, but literally it means just I or self. It's just in Latin, it means that.
Thank you.
Does that answer? Okay. You're welcome.
Next will be Anil. Anil, can you please unmute yourself?
Yes, Venerable. Geshema, thank you for this wonderful teaching that you've imparted along with the Rinpoche since yesterday. I had a couple of questions, you could say. One was
Oh, I can't hear you clearly. Sorry, Anil, you're gone suddenly. I can no longer hear you.
yes, Geshema, can you hear me? I have a very poor
Now I can hear you. I can hear you
today.
Oh yes, please start with the most important question to you. Start if you
Yeah,
have
the
many questions.
Tathagata Garbha Sutra. Yeah.
Which sutra?
The Tathagata
The
Garbha
Garbha
Sutra.
Sutra.
So about the Buddha nature.
Okay.
Now here it refers to, now this was a text which came out in the 3rd century, and it refers to the person is in the womb, and once he moves out, only then he can realize, the true Buddha nature. So as what is the womb out here which we refer to? Is it we are trapped into a soul or in a mind as an ego? How do you best explain this concept?
I think you referred to different examples. So the Tathagata Garbha Sutra, a sutra of the Buddha, is associated with the 3rd turning of the wheel of Dharma, and is the root text, of course, for Maitreya's Uttara Tantra, which is a text which is studied in this tradition, in particular in terms of, understanding Buddha nature. It's studied in order to understand Buddha nature. So this is the root sutra for that. And I'm more familiar with Uttara Tantra, Maitreya's text, where different examples are used to describe how Buddha nature is already there, but it's covered if you like. So one example you just gave is that of a womb, a baby being in the womb. Sometimes they give the example, another example that is given in the texts is like a Buddha statue, a golden statue that is covered in clay. So what does that clay stand for? Or like the womb? Well, my understanding is that our mind has Buddha nature, which is just another way of saying we have all the ingredients, we have everything we need to become a Buddha. Why? Because the type of mind that a Buddha has, we already have now. But our mind, different to the mind of a Buddha, is covered, if you like, or is obstructed by certain obstructions, by certain aspects. So the afflictive emotions, which of course go back to the self-grasping, and then that self-grasping, it leaves some residue in our mind. So there are all these aspects, mental aspects, that obstruct the mind. They're like the womb. So right now our mind, it's got the same nature as the mind of a Buddha, but it cannot come forth. So the baby in the womb, the baby is like this nature, the actual nature of our mind, and the womb that encloses the mind is like the obstructions, it's like the obscurations, which is showing us that in order to become Buddhas, we just need to remove that which obstructs us. So Buddhahood is not about gaining something new, but utilizing that which we already have and removing that which is extra. Our self-grasping, our misapprehension of reality, and all the other problems it gives rise to. Anil, does that answer that a little bit?
Sure, Geshema. Tashidele.
Great. Okay, next question.
I'm
sorry, this is where my watch is. I just want to make sure I'm not.
I think
going over
we are already a little bit over time, Geshe-la.
Are
I
we?
think review session is 1.5 hours.
Oh, I didn't know
Pamela-
that.
No,
Sorry.
I thought it 2 hours as well, but Pamela just told me.
Okay, great. I don't want to keep you any longer. I wasn't aware. It was an hour and a half. So are there, I believe there are probably no more questions. Are there more
Any
urgent
pressing
questions?
questions? Anybody? I take Anil's hand down and then we see lower hand. Anybody has a pressing question?
Doesn't look like it.
Everybody seems fine, Geshe-la. Thank you so much, Geshe-la.
Great. Sure, it was my pleasure. Sorry for the overtime. Okay, so all that remains is, well, if you can, please read this text if you're interested in continuing to study. And I need to say, Rinpoche is an amazing teacher. Besides the fact that he's this incredible Lama with incredible qualities, although he's so humble and is always in the back. But of course, the fact that he's always around his holiness, that there's definitely a reason for that. So that's just in terms of what we don't perceive. But on top of that, his incredible knowledge. I mean, we've just started this text. So if you really want to learn more about emptiness and so forth, he's an excellent scholar, and he actually, well, he definitely lives what he teaches. So I personally really look forward to receive the remainder of this text. I mean, to receive the remaining teachings, but to help you to make the most out of it, it's good if you read the text in advance, to read it as often as you can, in particular in preparation for class. And Kumbila, is this commentary available to people by Jeffrey Hopkins?
I have no idea. Who would I contact, Geshe-la? Jeffrey Hopkins himself? Oops. Yes.
If you can.
I try.
If you
sure.
can. So then we can use this commentary. I have it, but I don't have the permission to use it. So via Denzin Tsepa, for instance, or if you have his contacts, please get in touch with him. Then it'd be lovely to read his commentary, and then you have the same commentary that Rinpoche also uses.
Yes,
and it's helpful. Yeah. Okay. Great. So I'll take care. Well, Kumbila takes care of that, and then we can make it available. But in the meantime, please read this text in advance, and let's spend the last few minutes. We do recite a prayer, right? Let's just calm the mind, center the mind, and just take a moment to dedicate whatever virtue we've accumulated today. First of all, may it cause our precious lamas like His Holiness the Dalai Lama and our other precious spiritual masters to live a very, very long life. And may also lead to our own personal enlightenment so that we attain the state of a Buddha. Eventually, remove all the obscurations from our mind to fully actualize our potential for the welfare of all sentient beings. And may whatever virtue we've accumulated today, even right now, benefit others directly or indirectly. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Geshe-la. Thank you so much. So kind.
I just realized I forgot to do the refuge and bodhicitta at the beginning.
That's
Never
all.
mind. I'll do it next time. Okay.
You did the motivation. It was all perfect. Thank you so much, Geshe-la. And thank you so much for taking care. I just have to let everybody know Geshe-la quotes me, and says, oh, I made a no, she didn't say tiny. I say tiny mistake. She said, I made a huge mistake there. And then I go like, but Geshe-la, it's so tiny. And it's Geshe-la takes so much care to give us the best interpretation and really, listening to the teachings again. And and we are debating back and forth about the simultaneous and alternating translations. So we hope that we really give you, the best quality. Yes, of course, teachings and the translation. Thank you so much, Geshe-la. Very kind.
My pleasure. Thank you. All right. Have a good Sunday.
Have a good Sunday, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. See you next week, Saturday at 4 o'clock for Yangten Rinpoche's next teaching. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye. Bye-bye.